Dr. Williams, how are you?
I'm good. How are you doing, Mr. Wright? Good to see you.
Sorry, I muted you,
Oh,
Micah, but if you want to unmute, you're welcome to.
I, no, I said we met a long time ago, man.
I remember. Good to see you.
Yeah, thank you.
Greetings.
Of course, back at Temple. Yep.
Yes, to you.
So I'm not sure if she's not receiving things or working issues there. But
I'm going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to come and hear this talk. I am Dr. York Williams, faculty member at Westchester University in the proud Department of Special Education, and I welcome you all. I know that people will be dropping in, and feel free to ask questions. This is more so an engaging discussion, less so a formal presentation, and I like it like that. One of my favorite quotes, and again, one of my favorite authors, Dr. Maya Angelou. I share this, that we all should know that diversity makes for a rich tapestry, and we must understand that all the threads of the tapestry are equal in value, no matter their color. And so I think that a lot of the ongoing dialogue that we'll engage today will be very much so about the tapestry that we create through engaging the competencies with our students. I won't go through every aspect of the agenda, but just wanted to show you that I do have a lot, and I'm happy to share my presentation with you. And I do sort of go in a concrete sequential format, but I also enjoy being a little, taking a little dive. And so please implore, and let's jump in some other places. And I will spend a bulk of my time on talking about how I engage the competencies in the course that I teach, and now courses, and what that is evolving to look like over time, which is an ongoing, reflective, and axiomatic process. Overall, the goal is for us to gain an understanding and the foundation of these competencies. And in order to do that, I put a little by there, right? By exploring the foundational competencies of the culturally responsive sustaining education competencies and their application in creating an inclusive educational environment for special educators and students with diverse learning needs. An inclusive special educator does this also by unpacking the role that they play in fostering an inclusive educational environment that supports the diverse needs of students in learning with disabilities and intersectional identities. And then lastly, by examining the multifaceted dimensions of diversity and its relevance in preparing educators to effectively engage with students from diverse backgrounds, including those with learning disabilities. I don't usually read point by point, but I just thought that that was so important, that we're really taking some of these competencies and we're really insulating them in a particular content area so that we can really help those pre-service teachers and instructors as such to get the best bang out of the buck for what they would look like when they're fully unpacked. So I really thought that that was a great way to lay the foundation and also explore further what these competencies can do if done in a sort of like unique fashion, given your content area. I'll start with the course that I teach. I'm part of a partnership with another faculty member who helped to design the course. And of course, as a member of PEDC, I've done some work in constructing additional depth for some of the assignments in the course that are overall aligned with the CRSE competencies. So this is a diversity course, and students in our major and our minor are able to take the course. And my chair is on here, so I know that she can jump in as well to talk a little bit about the history of the course. But what's unique about the course is that it is one of the few culturally responsive, engaging courses that we offer in the College of Education and Social Work in an education department. So our students really do get a chance to get a good bang for the buck. And also this is good because it's situated in special education, which is sort of like a hallmark of diverse learning. So this is a really good opportunity for students to get some of the theoretical content, but also some of the practical nuts and bolts of teacher prep. This is just like a snapshot of the pacing guide. You see that there are a couple of modules here, and it's 2 modules per section. And so it culminates into about 14 to 15 modules over the term. And so each module is about 2 weeks. And then you also see some alignment with the CEC, Council for Exceptional Children, and our PDE objectives, in addition to the culturally responsive sustaining education competencies. So there is some alignment with the pacing guide as well. And the textbook I'm using is by Nieto and Bode. Approximately 57 students in my 2 cohorts from spring 22 to fall 23, 51 females, 4 males, only 1 African-American female, 1 Latinx female, 1 female identified as other, 1 female identified as LGBTQ, and then I had 1 female that was a dual language speaker. She was bilingual in Spanish. So not the greatest amount of diversity you can see, but still nonetheless some diversity. And then outside of my little designs there, I tried to create a unique design on the slides. You might still be able to see at the bottom, I noted dutifully that there's for no Black or Latino, Asian, or other males. So not that they can't benefit from this content, but again, it just goes to the overall predominance of the teacher preparation field at this point. And then the diversity concern. Again, people typically just think disability and nature of special education, but it's a little broader than that. This diversity does tend to extend beyond traditional categories of just IDA disabilities or other health impairment to include various factors that influence a student's learning experience. Here, the key aspects of special education diversity today that exist. And I think today we have the most diverse multi-language learner, gifted learner, student with other health impairment, and other kind of exceptionality that we now teach in our traditional inclusion classrooms in K-12 and now college. We're seeing a trend. So we want a little bit more than just a review of the practices as a class, but more so an exploration of how the competencies can inform our practice as I introduce them. And then for me personally and professionally, I wanted to see how and in which ways these competencies can impact good teaching and learning for special educator pre-service teachers. So that was my overall goal. Special education serves students, as you already well know, from a wide range of disabilities. And I just added this here for individuals who might not really be clear on what we teach and how we narrowly focus the content area. That is content specific, covering all disabilities and behavior disorders and other health impairments. Not exclusive, but more inclusive of those disabilities that impact K-12 learners. And also, we talk about diversity because it's important for us to remember that our kiddos are not just students with disabilities, but they are students from all different walks of life, all ranges of economic strata, and also linguistic diversities, and also identity diversity. And then inclusive practices is a common hallmark of our trade, in addition to the neurodiversity, when you think about students who have more profound disabilities or even mild disabilities who have neurodiversity, from, again, double helix dyslexia to just auditory processing, then to just dyslexia. And then there's the gender identity component as well, for students who identify as members with disabilities. And there's a whole field of individuals who identify with not only being identified as LGBTQ, but learning disabled or having a disability, people first language as well. And we talked about the socioeconomic diversity that exists, and that's diverse in and of itself, from more affluence to definitely high needs, to those who are in foster care, to now we're seeing an upsurge in individuals with homelessness. And then varied learning styles is a trade. So that's why we try to match those learning styles and needs with differentiated learning strategies and teaching strategies. So there's the learner and the teacher that can have differentiated content and pedagogical practices. And so the competencies that I utilized were 1 through 6. I know that I could have gone and added the other couple, 1 through 8, but I wanted to focus more so on these for this talk because these are the competencies that I use the most. And then I'll talk about why I started slow and how I sort of like built upon my practice. Reflecting on one's cultural lens, competency 2, I labeled C2, identifying, deepening, and understanding of and steps to take to address the bias in the system. And for my pre-service teachers, some of that was in the classroom, designing and facilitating culturally relevant learning that brings real-world experiences into the educational space and landscape. Competency 4, providing all learners with equitable and differentiated opportunities to learn and succeed, which connects with what I just shared a minute ago about the learning diversity of our learners and the neurodiversity that they present. Competency 5, promoting asset-based perspectives about differences. And then competency 6, collaborating with families and communities through authentic engagement. And when I have a chance to reflect and do this again, I really am interested more so in looking at how this collaboration can move from the classroom, the desk, to the computer, to the spaces that surround our schools and communities. So that's one of my goals, my professional growth goals, using the competencies. And Trainor reminds us that, again, the diversity is deeper than just the IDA. So I know it situates itself on the page as IDEA, but the IDA, the Individual Disability Education Act, it's deeper. So again, the terms cultural and social capital I use from her that she borrowed from Bourdieu really help us to see how culture and how social capital plays out in the lives of youth with disabilities, especially as it relates to transitioning into adulthood. And we don't really think about a lot of diversity that exists there, but it does. And we have to be ever so mindful that the way that we transition individuals with disabilities is not linear and it's not normative, but there need to be other kinds of intersections that allow us to think creatively and divergently for those individuals. So Trainor, I use her in some of the work and some of the readings and supplements in the course because she offers a diverse lens about the insufficient attention that's often given to cultural capital that our students already harness, right? But we don't really pull on that. So I'll talk about how some of the tools that we use in the classroom do pull some of that out. And then Ford talks about underrepresentation in gifted education and helping us to think that on the opposite end of the spectrum, when there's deficit thinking, when there's non-culturally responsive and non-inclusive thinking, that tends to undermine and weaken access to enrichment and gifted education. So on the other end of the spectrum, we have to ever be mindful. And I think that the competencies help us to process ourselves and also so that we can do better in preparing our students, our pre-service teachers, and collaborating with folks in the building as it relates to advanced placement, IB placement programs, enrichment opportunities, accelerated learning opportunities. And Nieto, who is the co-author of the textbook that I used, Affirming Diversity, suggests that educators in practice must deconstruct the norms and habits that institutions have developed that promote the sense of silent inclusion versus loud inclusion. So again, the opposite tends to happen if there's no reflection. And the competencies help us to think about what that looks like, that we'll get to in just a moment. But there must be a space for circumspection and growth in order to terminate hegemony in education, especially in special education, discourse and dialogue. And then another quote I enjoyed: diversity is not about how we differ. Diversity is about embracing one another's uniqueness, by Joseph. I thought that was right on time when we get beyond the page of diversity and when we really start to apply what the competencies can look like. And challenges and opportunities. So this is where I started to document and do some document analysis on my own, reflective document analysis, and think about what is really happening in the courses. So there are challenges and opportunities in special education teacher prep using the competencies. So I aligned them with what I phrased as the hallmark of this canon. First, the dimensions of diversity, elevating the discourse and diversity to encompass multiple dimensions beyond race, class, and language and ethnicity, which you don't really hear about a lot in teacher prep programs in special education. And then focusing on this intersectionality of students with learning disabilities. So again, seeing them as diverse learners first before they're learners with just a disability. And then I parallel that with competency 1, 2, and 5. And then the intersectionality, which are those theoretical constructs that weave in between ideas and identities and constructs, helps us to investigate the overlapping processes that's happening in the students' lives through the process of equity and inclusive practice across the educational setting. So we get a chance to see if we're actually carrying out the aims and the maxims that we're supposed to as not only instructors or professors, but also teachers in the classroom. And this is one of the areas that my students investigated in their interview with teachers. So like, what's the intersectionality between your teaching and practice and your students' performance? And then the learning disabilities in and of themselves, helping us to understand what that really does look like, that students will be on an educational journey all their lives with trying to construct meaning through their learning difference, but also building a framework whereby we understand that that's a learning difference and not a learning deficit. And then competency 4 and 5 were really helpful in the exploration of that. Continuing reflecting on one's own lens, that was critical. That's one of my favorite competencies, thinking about one's own practice and also correlating that with competency 3 and competency 6, because there is an empowerment piece. And so with understanding the power that you have in process and implementation and to promote change through educational discourse and dialogue, that's real power, that's real construction. And Trainor does talk a lot about that, as well as Nieto and Bode. Addressing bias, that's also directly in the competency, and strategically identifying and mitigating these biases in the educational system that really stack the deck against a lot of our kiddos with disabilities, and thereby creating an inclusive and equitable learning environment for all students. And that comes across competencies 2, 5, and 6. And then designing culturally relevant learning. That can be all of the competencies, but really crafting these learning experiences that integrate real world cultural context and experiences so as to engage and empower students from diverse backgrounds, including those specifically with learning differences and disabilities. And I gleaned that from competency 3, 4, and 5. And so providing equitable opportunities in order to promote equity and inclusion in the learning environment is the way to move. So advocating for fair and impartial access to these resources and opportunities for all students was something that, again, became a hallmark of the course. Regardless of the diverse learning needs or background, has to be equity and parity in providing access. And in special education, we tend to term that as LRE and FAPE, right? Least restrictive environment, free appropriate public education, through inclusive practice. But sometimes it still does not allow the learner to have unlimited equitable access to learning or equitable access to teachers who have the craft down pat, etc. And then differentiating instruction. This is the third time that you've heard this theme, because again, it's not narrow, it's not confined, it's not linear sequential, but again, it should move with the needs of the learner. So tailoring these approaches, the instructional content with accommodations to their diverse learning needs is also a linchpin of the competencies, that students learn differently and teachers teach differently. And so there's an opportunity for even LEAs and schools and principals to value the teaching diversity in their building. And we talked about that as well in class. I just posit, what does that look like in your practice area? So I just wanted to take a pause there and open it up and see if anyone is interested in sharing. What can this look like in your practice area if you want to share the courses that you teach? And I'll hang there for just a minute.
I'll come up on video so I can share. Yeah, thank you so much, York, for this. This is one area that I have, as department chair, sometimes I'm just wondering, how can we ensure that consistency across all the courses? Because I think one course does not cut it. We need a course that introduces the concepts and gets students into thinking along those lines. So how can we move it from just this one course to ensure that there is, that alignment is reflected in the methods courses, that alignment is reflected in just everything else? I teach the transition course. How can I incorporate elements of that alignment even in the courses that I teach? So definitely I commend you for doing that that work, because with disability we tend to be so confined in just disability that we miss out on the other intersectionalities that our students present. And then we miss out on even just using whatever skills or background knowledge, or I'm thinking along the lines of funds of knowledge and things like that, we fail to tap on that because we just hyper-focus on the disability. So this definitely, to me, is commendable and gives me a lot of food for thought in terms of how can we move the needle a little farther than just having one course. And yeah.
Thank you, Beatrice. And I think that the competencies are going to do just what we're hoping, that if we integrate them, just like we're trying to integrate the ISTE competencies, and just like we've integrated the PDE guidelines and the CRSE competencies, maybe this will now become, like you said, more than just isolated in one content area. And I know you're happy to see Trainor there, because that's since you're in secondary transition, that's your guru. So, you know, maybe we can use more of her logic as well, because there has to be social cultural capital across what we teach and how we train, so that our pre-service teachers will see it in the classroom. Has to be.
Definitely.
Thank you. And then I think just the idea of promoting the asset-based strategies. I love that the book talks about that, and that's in every chapter as well throughout, that they're not deficit-based, they're asset. How can we leverage the home, the grandmom, the auntie, the uncle? How can we leverage the paraprofessional in the space? How can we leverage the language diversity and just the wisdom? Donald Ford talks about students that have to catch 2 or 3 buses across the city to get to one place. How can we encourage their geographic diversity, their fund of knowledge? Beatrice talked about funds of knowledge, their whole luxury of resources that they use, not even realizing that they have geographic intelligence to get from an hour away as an 8-year-old that travels from Brooklyn to get to a good school, PS 140 in Manhattan. And just the logic of having to catch 3 or 4 different trains and a bus and never miss a day and be on time. That's diversity, and that's a strength. So just thinking about leveraging some of those assets that we take for granted so often versus the student who gets driven or picked up curve to curve, that's a big difference. And then we talked so far in our discussion about authentic engagement. That's an example of authentic engagement, especially with families who have differences, and talking with them and learning from them. And the competencies, definitely 6 and 7, help us to look at what that means. And like I said, I'm growing on competency 7 and 8, but I've started to integrate 7 through my interview project. And then for me, I also noted that I helped to build authentic engagement and partnerships through discovering learning opportunities, journals, independent research, interview, reflection logs, discussion posts, and then the growth goal. So for the first time this term, I integrated what I called a growth goal in my undergraduate and graduate course. And that was a requirement for the students to pick a competency and to measure at 3 different points in the term how it grew. And it was also fun because in special education, we utilize progress monitoring. So that was also an opportunity for them to monitor, self-monitor what they would be doing in practice for their students. And we do 3 out of 5. So where are you in this 3 out of 5 opportunities, and how do you know that you grew? So we did that, and I really liked that. And I had students comment that they liked it because they didn't really understand the competencies when we first talked about it and did it. But then each time that they monitored their progress and growth, they really did. And then I heard them last week in their interview presentations, and they sounded like true scholars. So it was like a dad proud of his or her children. Exciting to see that growth. So I'm hoping that it translates to their final case study projects as well, and I know that it will. So this is just a smattering of some of the assignments that I call formative assignments. They're not summative in nature, but they're tools that help to not only measure that growth from an instructor formative assessment perspective, but also to help the students to gauge their growth. There's a couple that I borrowed directly from the author. There's 2 here. I like the critical in action. I never heard of a dialogue poem before. And I also like expanding the curriculum. The rest of these are mine that I created. I have a case study on a student that borrows the most salient special education concepts from LRE all the way to stay put. And then I have here the diversity on a college campus, where we did a campus tour and they had to identify what was an aspect of race difference, race diversity, class gifted diversity, gender, sexual orientation, etc. Then they had to do a cross analysis in their group with some of the diversity concepts that they did quizzes on. And so this is another example of using the reflection here on who am I. So these are just an example. They also have chapter discussion questions where they have to unpack and add their own perspective grounded in the research in answering the question. So they can't just answer the question and give a page number, but they also have to answer the question and offer a diverse perspective on what the author's saying and the problem in the answer on what that looks like. And so this is an area where we all grew point of view, because I think that they would just take for granted that that's how they feel, and I don't need to go any deeper. But I want you to even understand that in order for you to be even an anti-racist instructor to combat racism, you still have to understand where it comes from and why might that individual think or react the way. Why might anti-Semitism be growing in this particular community? What might those other interculators feel is happening to them? You don't have to agree, but you have to seek the perspective in order to understand it and teach to it. So we've done a lot of that. And that's also number 2 for me in practice, because I see that they'll get the most out of that versus just accepting or just shutting the other person down. And I told them that's going to be critical in special education, especially when they're confronted with race and disability and difference, depending on where they want to teach. So they're going to have to grow in perspective seeking. I think we all do. And then addressing diverse needs for me was important, and using the competencies to do that would allow me to emphasize the importance of the relevance and then the sustainability part in the pedagogy, which means you should do it again, and it should be able to be done with fidelity. And so getting them to the level of fidelity and utilizing these competencies, it really is an ongoing, it's really an ongoing thing. It doesn't just end. And so I started to play around with micro-pedagogical strategies that would be quick fixes, that wouldn't be boring, that would get them to grow. So I took some of these strategies that we all know are hallmarks and put a little spin on them. So the questioning techniques was really that critical thinking and engagement, where they have to find the diversity in the question itself, even if it's learning diversity. Like, I'm a verbal learner. That's why I'm a good teacher. So what does that look like in practice? So I understand how you're expressing yourself, and I'm giving you that space as a student to express yourself and talk, rather than shutting you down and telling you to look in the book. So something as simple as that. Uncommon pair share, and I'll share these with folks: diversity visual aids, diversity mapping, where we look and see what's happening in images and in media. Visual aids, where they have to identify the learning style, kinesthetic, visual, auditory. Unteaching, we have fun with that, where we would find a problem and we would unteach a perspective on it and then teach what the perspective is. So like, we would do the bathroom ban. We would do even understanding what might be happening in certain parts of our state with the competencies, where there's tension, and unteaching what's wrong with it, calling it critical race theory, but then teaching what can be understood from it, which might be cultural responsive teaching, just understanding what's happening behind the misunderstanding. And so I call that unteaching. And students had to grow because they found themselves still teaching the perspective, but then not being able to go back and unpack it, unteach it, and to suggest that this is the right way to go about it, so that you can have like LGBTQ literature in the classroom, you can have multi-language literature in the classroom, you can offer perspectives, but you have to be prepared to unpack what people take for granted. And that will be also your parents taking for granted what they want in that space and being able to unpack it so that you can meet them somewhere. Think Proud Aloud, where they can think through. A lot of the students were, they were shy, and they held on to their own ideas and beliefs. So giving them the opportunity to practice thinking proud aloud of where they're coming from, and then putting their religious beliefs out there, putting their ethnic and social cultural beliefs out there, and then also realizing that they're not alone and that they can value and understand another's, and that goes back to that point of view, without shutting it down or turning away. The classroom response system, diversity saw, instead of the jigsaw, again, in small groups, they'd have to, again, now share the opposing point of view, and then also present the opposing point of view. of a problem. And we went across race, class, gender, ability, disability, and language. And the flipped Q classroom, giving them an assignment, a hot topic right before class, and then having them unpack it. They can do it when they get to class, but be prepared, and then they would present on it, but they also must post questions to one another's hot topic. And students seem to like that because it required them to be prepared once they step foot in the classroom. And then, like I said, the checklist for assessment, I shared with them, they had their growth goals. So 3 points in the semester, we measured and put evidence in place. And I didn't have them document the evidence. I'd have them just share the evidence. They had index cards for their names. So on the back of the index card, they had the competency that they wanted to grow in. And at 3 points, they would just put down what was the evidence that they were really growing in that competency. And they would just write it down. And what I'll do is I'll collect the cards week after next, which will be our last week, and then I'll be able to share with them. So what do you think about this evidence? They'll have a small group discussion because this was done when I introduced the competencies, which was the second week of class. So they've grown ever since then, and they have at least 3 points, 3 data points to show, oh, I did this, and this is what I understood. I grew here. So just thinking about it, and I know we had like 12 or so, or 11 or so people register. So I was thinking, depending on the number that we had, thinking about how strategy might work in your class. So I'm just curious to hear. So Beatrice and Micah, I know it's only you two, but I'm curious to hear from those presented, which strategy do you think you would utilize, or what strategies do you already use that might get at the diverse content that the competencies lend to us?
I'll probably go fast. So the one that I'm probably already using a little bit is the flipped Q classroom, and the diversity visual aids. But the one that's new to me that I think I really like is Think Proud Aloud. I probably want to incorporate because I can see how I'm just, when you shared it, I'm already thinking of how it can be incorporated across just different courses.
Yes.
Or just something to get them started. And if I can have week by week or even bi-weekly, just different things for them to think about, could be a scenario, could be a vignette, could be just something that gets them to be thinking, and then they can comfortably come and share it. And if it's a practice or routine that I establish at the start of the semester, then over time they get very comfortable doing it. It may be rough the first few semesters, but once they understand the purpose, I think it's a great icebreaker just to get the class started and get to the content week by week, but just to get them to open up and talk and think.
Yeah. And you know what? This was the hardest one, Beatrice, and I used this the most because I saw that they were reluctant to be proud and loud. And so with what they were thinking, but so I started to allow them the opportunity to, in a case study, think about the pride of another. And then that also helped with the point of view. Our students had a hard time being proud and loud, and also identifying an opposing point of view. And I would use things like, well, why do you think that like you see the majority of Black students in the cafeteria all sitting together? Like, how are they, what do you think their experience might be, even on a college campus? And we know that that was a book, right? And we know that that's a whole, series, but many of our students haven't seen it. And I wanted them to think, well, how are they feeling? And then how are you feeling? And does it send you back to some point of segregation? And they really couldn't process that. But then the more that we started to dig and their peers started to think aloud, well, I sit with majority white students too. And I can understand, since they're the minority, it doesn't seem like it, but they are. And so all these connections they start to make, And then instead of them feeling like, oh, they just don't want to be integrated, they want to do their own thing, which was what students used to say on Westchester. Now, some of them are now thinking, oh, that just might be a safe haven. They might have come from majority minority school districts. And so they're now feeling more comfortable to recreate and mimic what they have come from. But this is now an opportunity for me to say hi, introduce myself, and diversify their experience a little bit, since I'm in the majority. So that's how far we came. But you can imagine, you don't start there with undergraduates, even upperclassmen. And that's where I wanted them to be, not to make an excuse for the exclusion, but to build an understanding and seek a perspective. So that was really, just sharing, that was really a hard one for us. And it was hard, but I kept doing it because I'm thinking, you're going to be teachers. This is your tool for life. You're going to be making, 6 figures one day from this thing. And so I want you to get out there and do that. But they really struggle with that. Perspective seeking. Yeah, number 6 and number, the perspective one. I'll just go on to the next one. And then I pretty much talked about that. And then I talked about measuring student success self-reflectively. And then what I did was the culminating projects, the summative assessment was their case study projects. And they had to create a couple of tools with that. And then I had to collect the data and analyze the data to make sure that I was still in line with the competencies. So their culminating assignment is the diversity case study. And I just gave you a little snippet. And then with the diversity case study, they had a diversity culture responsive toolkit. And then they also had a culture responsive action plan. So the toolkit was first, but now they had to talk about how they're going to implement it. And you can see over here to the right that their toolkit had to be aligned with their competencies. And they had the 6 competencies. And then they had to utilize research and handouts from the case study resource folder and the textbook in order to talk about what strategy or what tool. And they also could use a trauma-informed or social-emotional learning tool. But this way, not only are they growing and learning, but it's now implemented. And they also now have a resource that they can take to their next class and into their student teaching and actually into life. And I actually had graduate students who were excited about this because they said, oh yeah, finally something that can be printed and shared and reflected upon. And things like having a diversity fair by October was something that you can plan for the previous spring or over the summer. Teachers now in the state get about, schools now get about 15 to 20 hours to have teams of teachers come in to do planning. And that's a whole different bucket of resource monies that principals and districts can use. And this is something that can be helpful in facilitating their year-round PBIS and or their year-round social-emotional learning continuum. And also usually PBIS can encapsulate all of them. And then just where you see the competencies throughout the case study itself with all those moving parts, and it is largely born from the competencies. And so there's constant reminder and review on what their work should look like and their tool that again are built from the competencies. And students are working on that at this point in the term now. And then continuous education, again, these are the competencies that speak to it, especially strengthening those skills. That's what the case study project is meant to do, so they can better serve diverse student populations. And again, remember that the diversity is not just on Black, white, brown, bilingual. That's the learning diversity, the economic diversity as well, the identity diversity, the aptitude or the gifted diversity as well. And then collaborative learning, because they were in groups and they had to be IEP team groups that had this as their goal. And impact and benefit, definitely in the process of seeing great learning outcomes, enhance student engagement from implementing some of the competencies into the content curricula, and also improve learning outcomes. Students don't feel stressed by a test or another kind of formative and summative assessment or a quiz, but students can apply and they can engage, and they can also have opportunities for discovery learning and independent learning, and that builds their repository to really go out there and implement this stuff. With the term that I use, we're looking for fidelity and not for it to be rough and tough. And then just my growth, I started with the focus on at least 3 competencies because I didn't really know C1, C2, and C5. My list did grow. I did increase the depth of my activities with graduate students. I would also isolate them from lectures and discussion at first because I didn't really know how to embed the competencies. I did not integrate them with assignments at first, but rather only reference them from a short distance away because I really didn't know. And I really did not know them. And at first, I did not let them know who I was. So this whole growth is about you being axiomatic and growing with the competencies and letting the competencies grow you. And now I started off with the first week of class, introducing the competencies. I allow students to unpack them in class and in discussions and make connections to them. Students now make connections on their own and without my guidance, which again, it's like seeing your child walk. It's exciting. Students and I both assess using the competencies, and we look at them as our co-pilot to fly through the content, allowing us to dig a bit deeper in the surface and allowing us to question ourselves. So you'll note that the competencies are much more about questioning and monitoring your growth with praxis and practice. And I'm proud of myself. I'm now up to competency 7. So I'm growing, I'm getting there with comfort, one competency at a time. And then again, who I am and who are you? These are all the things that I am and more. And so using the competency, some of these come right out and some of them just are natural inclinations to exploring diversity, being an advocate, challenging power dynamics, bumping up against hegemonious practices, being an ally. But then some of them are, I'm still growing and what that looks like, the relationship between the competencies and myself. So one of the things that will happen is that you'll find a symbiotic potential relationship between some of them and others, and it's okay. That has to be okay, because that's how you use any competency, but that's how you would use these CRSE competencies. And then again, what we've attempted to do today was summarize learnings and takeaways from the implementation of the competencies, reflect on the impact that the inclusive pedagogical practices can have on student learning, and how being interwoven with the competencies is just one important transition point to teaching and learning with them through projects. And then we have examined and made recommendations for inclusive special educators, actionable recommendations and strategies for inclusive special educators to enhance their practice, to cultivate a more culturally responsive and sustaining approach by encouraging continuous reflection, collaboration, and growth within the field of special education. And making space for what's next. Again, the competencies really in and of themselves make space for trauma-informed care, culturally relevant pedagogy, special education overall, gifted education, ESL, ELL work, depending on what state you're in, what term they're going to use now for our kiddos with language needs, social work practice, counseling practice, law, criminal justice, business, educational leadership, ed psychology, school psychology, restorative practice, and more. So, you know, these competencies make space for the teaching and learning of this content, and this content can make space for the inclusion of the competencies. So it really is a good marriage. So where do we go from here, and pretty much what's next for you? So I know that we have more people. I was hoping to hear from you guys, but you definitely can chat it and definitely send some ideas to me, so that this is the beginning of an ongoing dialogue, not the end. And just some additional references I had. And there's my contact information as well. So I'll pause there and thank you for your time. Thank you for coming. You guys were the best and easiest audience I've ever had for a presentation.
All right, thank you so much. A lot to learn as we continue on this journey.
Mm.
Um,
It is a journey.
yes, it is. There's a lot of things that as I review the competencies that I realize, oh, I need to
Mhm.
work on this area in that area. So
Mhm.
it's work in progress.
Mhm.
Mhm.
I'm excited about it. I think this is the only inclusive kind of curricula or strategy from the state that really is reflective in nature and allows you to grow while you're using it to help to grow others. So thank you guys.
Thank you so much, York.
There's my information. Thank you.
I'm gonna stop recording.